The door appeared on a Tuesday, not a new door. The wood was old oak, darker than the rest of the hallway, with iron hinges that looked hand-forged. But I'd walked past that stretch of wall every day for 3 weeks, and on Monday night it had been plaster and wallpaper, faded green wallpaper with a repeating pattern of ivy that I'd memorized while carrying boxes up and down the stairs. I stood there with a coffee mug in my hand, steam rising between me and the door, and I couldn't make myself move forward or backward, because I'd measured this house. I'd walked every inch of it with the estate attorney. I'd reviewed the original 1692 blueprints at the Salem Historical Society, spreading them across a table in their archive room, while a volunteer in bifocals pointed out where additions had been made over the centuries. There was no room here. The hallway was interior, windowless, running between my bedroom and what had been Aunt Mary's sewing room. Outside, I'd stood in the side yard just yesterday and looked up at this exact section of the house. Solid wall, no windows, no dormers, no architectural anomaly that would suggest hidden space. But the door was real. I could see where decades of hands had worn the finish near the handle, leaving a smooth depression in the wood grain. Could see a gap at the bottom where light should come through but didn't, just darkness, solid and absolute. I set down the coffee on the floor and touched the door. It was cold. February morning cold, the kind of cold that comes from stone left in shadow, though the rest of the house stayed warm from the radiators that clanked and hissed through the night. And when I pulled my hand back, my fingerprints stayed on the wood, not in dust, but in something that looked like frost, crystalline and delicate, forming patterns that spread slowly outward from where I'd touched. The frost shouldn't exist. The hallway was heated. The thermostat on the wall read 68 degrees. I wiped my palm on my jeans and reached for the handle. The inheritance came through 3 days after Aunt Mary's funeral, delivered by a tall woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Patricia Vance, estate attorney. I hadn't expected it. We'd only met twice, once when I was 7 and she visited Portland for a cousin's wedding, giving me a porcelain doll I'd been afraid to play with, and again at my mother's funeral when I was 19. Both times she'd been kind but distant, a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, who smelled like lavender and rarely smiled, but whose eyes were gentle when she looked at me. Then I got the call. The house in Salem, Massachusetts was mine. All of it. The furniture, the contents, the building itself. 3 stories of colonial architecture on Essex Street, built in 1692, with original hand-hewn beams and windows made of crown glass that warped everything you saw through them. The only condition was that I had to live there for at least 6 months before I could sell. It's important, Patricia had said, sitting across from me in a coffee shop near my apartment in Boston. She was very specific about that clause. 6 months of residence before any decisions about the property. Did she say why? Patricia had looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She said you'd understand when the time came. I arrived on the 15th of January, driving through streets where every third building claimed some connection to the witch trials of 1692. Tourist shops sold crystals and tarot cards. Restaurants had names like The Cauldron and Hexed. Even in winter, with most of the seasonal businesses closed, Salem wore its history like a costume it couldn't take off. The house sat on Essex Street, a narrow 3-story colonial that leaned slightly to the left, as if it had spent 3 centuries listening to the street's secrets, and the weight of what it heard had shifted its foundation. Dark wood siding weathered to a deep gray. Windows with real crown glass, not reproductions, that distorted the view and created rainbows when the sun hit them at certain angles. A front door painted black, though I could see layers of other colors underneath where the paint had chipped. Red, then blue, then what might have been yellow beneath that. Inside, everything was exactly as Aunt Mary had left it. Teacups in the kitchen sink, one still holding an inch of cold tea. Books face down on tables, spines cracked at whatever page she'd been reading. A sweater draped over the back of a chair in the living room, reading glasses on the mantel, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the dining table, her handwriting in blue ink filling in the boxes. It didn't feel like she'd died. It felt like she'd stepped out to run an errand and would return any moment, calling out a greeting as she hung up her coat in the front hall. But she wouldn't. The death certificate said heart failure, sudden and complete. The attorney explained she was found in the upstairs hallway at 7 a.m. by a neighbor who had a key and came by daily to check on her. No signs of distress, no indication of pain, just gone, as if her heart had simply decided it was finished. She was 73, I'd spent the first 3 weeks sorting through her things, learning the house's rhythms and peculiarities. The way the floorboards in the front bedroom creaked in a specific pattern. 3 groans, then silence, then one final complaint, no matter how carefully you walked. The draft that came down from the attic even when all the windows were sealed and the door at the top of the narrow stairs was closed. The smell that lingered in certain corners of the second floor. Not unpleasant, but old. Not the smell of decay or mustiness, but the smell of time itself, of air that had been breathed and replaced and breathed again for 300 years. And every night, I walked this hallway to my bedroom. Every single night, sometimes twice if I got up for water or couldn't sleep. The wall was just a wall, plaster over wooden lath, papered in that faded green ivy pattern that was probably from the 1940s based on the style, until Tuesday morning, when it wasn't. When instead of a wall, there was a door. Before we continue, subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories like this. Stories these houses were never meant to tell. I didn't open the door right away. First, I set the coffee down carefully on the hallway floor, then went back to my bedroom and grabbed my phone. I took photos of the door from multiple angles, straight on, from the side, close-ups of the hinges and the handle. Then I measured the hallway with a tape measure I'd been using to catalog Aunt Mary's furniture for eventual sale. From the wall of my bedroom to the wall of the sewing room, 16 feet on 2 inches. I measured again to be sure. Same result. Then I went outside into the side yard, the February cold biting through my sweatshirt as I stood in the dead grass and looked up at the house. My bedroom window on the right. I could see the corner of my lamp visible through the warped glass. The sewing room window on the left, curtains drawn, as they had been since I arrived. Between them, blank wall, just wooden siding, weathered and old, with no indication of any opening. I counted the boards, noted where the nails were, took more photos. Back inside, I stood in front of the door again and measured from my bedroom wall to the door. 7 feet, 3 inches. From the door to the sewing room wall, 8 feet, 4 inches. 7 feet, 3 inches plus 8 feet, 4 inches equals 15 feet, 7 inches. There should have been 5 more inches of hallway, which meant the door itself, the physical wood and frame, was occupying space that didn't exist according to the exterior dimensions. I called the estate attorney first, got voicemail, left a message that probably sounded unhinged. Hi, Patricia. This is Emma Thorne. I have a question about the house. There's a door that I don't think was here before. Can you call me back? Then I called the Salem Historical Society, where I'd spent 2 afternoons researching the house's history. A young woman answered, her voice bright with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who loved their job. A historical society, this is Jen. Hi, Jen. I was there last week, looking at records for the Essex Street properties. Oh, sure, the Ashford house, right? What can I help you with? I found something, a door, in the upstairs hallway, and I'm trying to figure out if it's original to the house or if it was added later, but I can't find any record of it in the blueprints. A pause. What kind of door? Just a door. Oak, I think. Old hinges. It leads to what looks like another room, but from the outside, there's no indication that the room exists. Huh. I could hear paper shuffling. Colonial houses are architecturally complex. Lots of renovations over the centuries, additions, sealed rooms that were later opened. It's not uncommon to discover spaces that aren't in the official records, especially if modifications were done without permits or formal documentation. But I measured, I said. From outside, the dimensions don't match. Another pause, longer this time. Then perhaps it's a closet, or a chimney chase. Those were often built into walls and can create confusing internal geometry. Or maybe it's a gap between walls where they added insulation in the 50s or 60s. These houses have unusual architecture. They were built by hand, often without formal plans. It was a reasonable explanation. I wanted to believe it. Would you like me to check if we have any additional records? Jen asked. Sometimes we get private papers donated that include details not in the official archives. That would be great. Thank you. No problem. I'll email you if I find anything. I hung up and stared at the door. It was still there, still solid, still impossible. The handle was iron, black with age, shaped like a simple lever. I reached out and touched it. Warm. The handle was warm, while the door itself was still cold. I pulled my hand back. Then, because standing in the hallway wasn't going to solve anything, I grabbed the handle firmly and turned it. The mechanism inside the door moved smoothly, well-oiled, despite what should have been centuries of neglect. If the door was truly original to the house. The door swung inward, revealing darkness. I fumbled for the light switch on the hallway wall, flipped it up. The hallway light came on, spilling into the space beyond the door. It was a room, small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, though the dimensions seemed to shift slightly when I tried to focus on them. Walls painted a deep blue-gray, the color of a storm cloud just before it breaks open. No furniture, no decorations, just 4 walls, a wooden floor, and a ceiling that was slightly lower than the rest of the second story, making the space feel compressed, claustrophobic. And on the far wall, someone had written directly on the plaster in what looked like pencil, the handwriting shaky and uncertain. Mary knows below it, in different handwriting, clearer, more controlled. Someone had added, "Keep." I took a step backward. My heel hit the door frame, and I grabbed it to steady myself. The door slammed shut. Not from wind. There was no wind. Not from my movement. I hadn't touched it. The house just closed it, firmly, deliberately. The sound echoed through the room. I was no longer in and down the hallway behind me, and in that echo, I heard something else, a settling, like the house was rearranging itself around this new reality, adjusting to my presence in a space I wasn't supposed to find. I grabbed the handle again. It turned easily, and the door opened. The hallway was exactly as I'd left it. My coffee mug still sat on the floor, the liquid inside now cold. I looked back at the door, then at the space beyond it. The room was still there, still 10 by 10, still blue-gray, but now there was a window. I hadn't seen a window before. I was certain I hadn't, but there it was on the far wall, adjacent to where the writing was. A single window with 6 panes, old crown glass that distorted the view beyond. Through the window, I could see the side yard, the same view I'd just been looking at from outside, the dead grass, the neighbor's fence, the bare branches of the oak tree that grew close to the property line. I was looking at an exterior view from inside a room that had no exterior. My hands started shaking. I pulled out my phone and took photos of everything. The room, the window, the writing on the wall. Then I backed out of the doorway, closed the door, and went downstairs. I spent the next 4 hours trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that stress and grief had created some kind of hallucination. Aunt Mary had just died. I was living alone in a strange house, in a strange city. My mind was playing tricks, but when I went back upstairs before dinner, the door was still there. And when I opened it, the room was still there. And on the wall, the writing had changed. Mary knows keep she stayed. The next morning, I called a general contractor. His name was Mike Russo, and he'd been recommended by the estate attorney when I'd asked about getting the house assessed for potential sale. He'd lived in Salem his entire life, 63 years, he told me when he called back, and he'd worked on dozens of historical properties. "What can I help you with?" he asked. "I found a room," I said, "in my house, and I need someone to tell me if it's structurally sound or if I should be worried." "What kind of room?" "Just a room. It's on the 2nd floor, but it's not in any of the architectural records, and I'm trying to understand how that's possible." He arrived around 10 that morning, driving a white pickup truck with Russo Construction, painted on the side in blue letters. He was shorter than I'd expected from his voice, maybe 5'7", with weathered hands that looked like they'd spent decades holding tools. He wore a canvas jacket despite the cold and carried a clipboard. "Show me," he said, after we'd exchanged basic pleasantries. I led him upstairs. The door was there, exactly as it had been. I'd left it closed overnight, and part of me had hoped it would be gone in the morning. But it remained. Dark oak, iron hinges, impossible. Mike studied it for a long moment without speaking. Then he pulled out a tape measure and checked the hallway dimensions, writing numbers on his clipboard. He checked them again, frowning. Then he pulled out his phone and took photos from multiple angles. "This is original construction," he said finally. "What? The door, the frame, the hinges." He pointed to each element as he spoke. "And this isn't a recent addition. This has been here since the house was built. Look at the wood grain. It matches the other original doors. Look at the hinges. They're hand-forged iron, same as the ones on the first floor doors. This is 1692 craftsmanship. But it wasn't here before." He gave me a look that was carefully neutral, the kind of look that said he'd heard strange things before and knew better than to dismiss them outright. "You're certain?" I've walked past this wall every day for 3 weeks. Okay. He wrote something on his clipboard. Mind if I open it? Go ahead. He reached for the handle without hesitation and pulled the door open. The room was revealed exactly as it had been. Blue-gray walls, compressed ceiling, the window showing the impossible view. Mike stepped inside, and I followed. He walked immediately to the window and peered out, his breath fogging the glass. The angle's wrong, he said after a moment. What do you mean? This window. He tapped the glass. It's showing the side yard, but the perspective is off. We should be looking straight down from this height, but instead it's at an angle, like we're farther west than we should be. Like the room is. He trailed off. Like the room is where? I pressed. So like it's occupying space that isn't there. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you might note that a pipe was leaking or a beam was cracked. He moved to the walls and knocked on them. Solid plaster over lath, the sound dull and heavy. He checked the floorboards, crouching down to run his hand along the seams. Original pine, hand-cut, matching the rest of the house. He examined the ceiling, traced the corners where it met the walls with his fingers. This room is sealed, he said, standing up and brushing dust from his knees. What does that mean? No vents? No radiator? No electrical outlets or fixtures? Nothing connecting it to the house's systems. It's like, he turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. It's like someone built a room inside the house but deliberately kept it separate, isolated. Why would anyone do that? Mike shrugged, but his expression was troubled. Oh, old houses in Salem. People did lots of things for lots of reasons. Hidden rooms for runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad. Priest holes for Catholics when that wasn't popular. Places to hide valuables during the Revolutionary War. Or, he gestured at the writing on the wall. Or sometimes they sealed rooms because something happened in them. Something they didn't want to remember, or didn't want anyone else to find out about. I looked at the words again. Mary knows. Keep. She stayed. This handwriting, Mike said, moving closer to examine it. It's not recent. Look at how the pencil marks have faded into the plaster. This has been here for years, maybe decades. The house is over 300 years old. The house, yes, but plaster gets replaced, walls get repainted. This specific plaster. He scratched gently at the surface with his thumbnail. This is maybe 1920s, 1930s. Someone renovated this room relatively recently in the house's timeline and left these messages, or someone wrote on already old plaster. He pulled out his phone and took photos of the writing, then of the window, then of the corners where the walls met the floor. I'd like to bring a colleague, he said. Guy, I know who specializes in historical preservation. He's got equipment that can tell us more about the structure, thermal imaging, moisture detection, that kind of thing. Would that be okay? Yes, please. He nodded, still looking troubled. I'll call him today. We'll come back tomorrow or the day after. Before he left, he stood in the doorway of the room and looked back at it one more time. You know what's strange? He said. Everything about this is strange. Fair point. But what's strange is that the room feels... He paused, searching for the right word. Occupied. Like someone's still using it. There's no dust accumulation, no cobwebs, no signs of age beyond the plaster. It's like the room is being maintained. Maintained by who? That's the question, isn't it? After Mike left, I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door. Then I went online and started researching the house's history more thoroughly than I had before. Not just the architectural records, but ownership records, census data, newspaper archives, anything that might explain what this room was for and why it had been hidden. What I found was a pattern. The house had never been sold to a stranger. For 334 years, it had passed from woman to woman within the same family line, always to a niece, never to a daughter. The chain was unbroken. Thomas Ashford built the house in 1692. When he died in 1724, it went to his sister Margaret. When Margaret died in 1759, it went to her niece Elizabeth. When Elizabeth died in 1801, it went to her niece Catherine. On and on, generation after generation, the house passing from aunt to niece in an unbroken chain that led directly to Aunt Mary, and now to me. And every single one of them had died in the house. Not violently. The records were clear on that. Heart failure, mostly, or strokes, natural causes, the death certificates said, but always sudden, and according to multiple newspaper obituaries I found, always in the upstairs hallway, just like Aunt Mary. I found a newspaper clipping from 1952 about Mary's predecessor, A woman named Catherine Winters. Beloved teacher dies at home, the headline read. The article was brief. Catherine had been 57, taught English at Salem High School for 30 years, was found by her niece Mary Thorne, my aunt then 19, who had been living with her while attending Salem State College. There was a photo with the article. A younger Aunt Mary, her face grave, standing on the front steps of this house. I kept searching. Another article from 1919. Prominent suffragette found dead. Elizabeth Ashford, age 64, discovered by her niece Catherine Winters, age 23. Another from 1878. Margaret Crane, age 71, found by niece Elizabeth Ashford, age 19. The pattern held all the way back to the beginning. Women living in this house alone, passing it to their nieces, dying suddenly in the upstairs hallway, and nowhere in any of the records, architectural surveys, tax documents, insurance papers, was there any mention of a sealed room on the second floor. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me, the familiar creaks and groans taking on new significance. Every sound felt intentional, like the house was speaking in a language I didn't yet understand. Around 2 a.m, I got up and walked to the door. It was warmer now than it had been that first morning. Not hot, but no longer cold enough to leave frost. I touched the wood, and it felt almost alive under my palm, not moving, but present in a way that wood shouldn't be. I opened the door. The room was dark, but light from the hallway spilled in enough for me to see. The window was still there, though at night it showed only darkness and the faint glow of the streetlight 2 houses down. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, my breath visible in the air, but it wasn't the cold that made me freeze. It was the sound. Someone was breathing. Not me. The rhythm was different, slower, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere, like the room itself was breathing, its walls expanding and contracting with each inhalation. Hello. My voice sounded small in the compressed space. The breathing stopped. Then, from the walls, from inside the walls, a voice. You came back. Not loud, barely more than a whisper, but clear, unmistakable. I stumbled backward through the doorway and into the hallway, my heart hammering. The door stayed open behind me, darkness spilling out. From inside the room, the voice came again. They always come back. I slammed the door shut and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Whatever was in that room wasn't something a lock could keep out. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. And in the morning, when I finally gathered the courage to look, the door was still there, and written beneath the existing messages were new words. Mary knows keep she stayed. You came back. Mike returned 2 days later with his colleague, a man in his 70s named Dr. James Whitmore, who introduced himself as a historical preservation specialist with the Massachusetts Historical Commission. He had white hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful movements of someone who'd spent a lifetime handling fragile things. They brought equipment, thermal imaging cameras, moisture meters, density scanners, and something Dr. Whitmore called a structural penetrating radar that could see through walls. I showed them the room. By now, the writing on the wall had grown to 6 lines, though I hadn't seen anyone add to it. Mary knows. Keep she stayed, you came back. It's your turn. Now don't forget, Doctor. Whitmore stood in the doorway for a long time before entering, studying the frame, the hinges, the way the door sat in its frame. Remarkable, he murmured. They spent 3 hours examining the room. I watched from the hallway as they scanned the walls with their equipment, took measurements, made notes on clipboards. They barely spoke to each other, communicating mostly through gestures and nods. Finally, they emerged, and Dr. Whitmore's expression was deeply troubled. May we speak downstairs? He asked. We sat in the kitchen. I made coffee while they conferred quietly, reviewing their notes. When I set the mugs in front of them, Dr. Whitmore looked up at me with something like concern. Miss Thorne, he said, have you ever heard of architectural impossibilities? No, they're structures that shouldn't exist according to the laws of physics and geometry, but do anyway. Usually they're optical illusions, clever designs that make spaces appear larger or smaller than they are. But occasionally, he paused, occasionally you encounter spaces that genuinely don't make sense. Rooms that are bigger on the inside than the outside. Hallways that connect to different floors than they should. Windows that show views they couldn't possibly show. Like the window in that room. Exactly like that window. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo he'd taken of the thermal scan. Look at this. See these lines? They represent heat signatures. The rest of the house shows normal thermal patterns. Warmer near the radiators, cooler near the windows. But this room, he zoomed in on the scan of the sealed room. It shows no heat transfer at all. The room is exactly the same temperature throughout, regardless of what's happening in the rest of the house. It's as if the room exists in its own isolated environment. What does that mean? I don't know, he admitted. The structural radar showed something even stranger. The walls of that room, they register as solid, but they also register as hollow. The scanner is picking up two contradictory readings simultaneously. Mike leaned forward. We also checked the exterior of the house again, very carefully. The room shouldn't exist based on the external dimensions. When we measured from the neighbor's property line to your property line, then looked at the house's position, there's literally no space for that room to occupy. So, what is it? The two men exchanged a glance. I think, Dr. Whitmore said slowly, that this room was deliberately built to be separate, not just sealed or hidden, but architecturally divorced from the rest of the structure. The original builder created a space that doesn't follow normal rules. How is that possible? I don't know. But I've seen one other example of this in my career. A house in Providence that had a room no one could agree on the dimensions of. Different people measuring it would get different results. That house was built in 1688 by a man who'd studied architecture in Europe and brought back some very unusual ideas about how spaces could be constructed. Thomas Ashford, I said. The man who built this house. Was he educated in Europe? I don't know, but I can research it. After they left, promising to look into the historical records and consult with colleagues, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went upstairs and opened the door again. The room looked the same. Blue-gray walls, low ceiling, impossible window. But the writing on the wall was different. Mary knows, keep she stayed. You came back. It's your turn now, don't forget ask her. Ask her? I said aloud. Ask who? The room didn't answer. But on the floor in the corner, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A pencil. Just a regular pencil. Worn down to a nub. Sitting on the bare floorboards like it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up. The wood was old. The paint faded. But it was real. Physical. Not a hallucination. And on the side, in tiny letters almost too small to read, was a name. Mary Thorne. My aunt's pencil. She'd written these messages. Or at least some of them. I looked at the wall again. At the different handwritings. Multiple people had written here. Multiple women. Each adding their messages to those left by the ones before. What were you keeping? I asked the empty room. This time, I felt the answer more than heard it. A weight in the air. A pressure against my chest. The room wanted me to understand something, but I didn't have enough information yet. I needed to know more about Thomas Ashford and why he'd built this house the way he had. I spent the rest of that day and all of the next at the Salem Historical Society and the Salem Public Library, pulling every document I could find about the Ashford family. What I discovered made everything worse. Thomas Ashford had been a merchant, moderately wealthy, who'd made his money trading goods between Salem and Boston. He'd built the house in 1692, the year of the witch trials. The house had gone up in September, just before the trials ended. He'd been widowed. His wife had died in 1690. He'd had one child, a daughter named Anne, born in 1675. The record said Anne died in 1692 of fever. She was 17. But there was something strange about the death record. It was dated September 15th, 1692, the same month and year the house was completed. And the record was sparse, unusual for the time. Just Anne Ashford, daughter, died of fever, with no other details. I found Thomas Ashford's will, written in 1724, shortly before his death. Most of it was standard, property distributions, business matters, but there was one unusual clause, the house on Essex Street to pass to my sister Margaret, with the understanding that she maintain its integrity and privacy. Certain rooms are to remain undisturbed. She knows which ones and why. Certain rooms, plural. I went back to the house with a new determination. If there was one hidden room, there might be others. I spent hours that night going through every floor, every closet, every corner. I measured walls. I looked for inconsistencies in the plaster. I checked for hollow sounds when I knocked. And on the third floor, in what had been Aunt Mary's bedroom, I found something. The closet was too shallow. It should have been deeper based on the external wall position. I knocked on the back wall, hollow. I pressed against the wood paneling, searching for a latch or a hinge. Nothing. But when I pushed hard against the upper right corner, something clicked. A section of the paneling swung inward, revealing a narrow space. Not a room, just a gap between walls, maybe 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Inside was a metal box. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. It wasn't locked. Inside were documents, letters, journal entries, legal papers. I took the box downstairs and spread the contents across the kitchen table. The first document I picked up was a letter, dated 1724, written in a woman's hand. To whoever inherits this house after me, my brother Thomas asked me to keep his secret. He said it was for love, that what he did was necessary to protect our family. I have maintained his wishes for these past months, though it troubles my sleep. The room on the 2nd floor must remain sealed. What is kept there must not be disturbed. I do not know if this is mercy or cruelty, but I am bound by my promise to him. When you read this, you will understand why. Margaret Ashford Chambers. I picked up another document, a journal entry, this one in a different hand. 1759. Aunt Margaret died today. Before she passed, she showed me the room and told me what it contains. I wept. I raged. I wanted to tear down the walls, but she made me swear to keep it as it is. It's too late to change it, she said. All we can do now is remember and protect. I don't understand how remembering is protection, but I will honor her wishes. God forgive us all. Elizabeth Ashford. More entries, more letters, each from a different woman, each confirming the same pattern. Discovery, horror, acceptance, continuation. The most recent was in Aunt Mary's handwriting, dated 3 months before her death. Emma will inherit this house when I'm gone. I've tried to prepare everything for her, but I don't know how to explain what she'll find. The room has been here since the beginning. What's kept there has been kept for good reason, though the reason becomes harder to justify with each passing year. We are guardians of a terrible secret, and the weight of it has broken me. I hope Emma is stronger than I was. I hope she finds a better way. Mary Thorne. I sat back, my heart pounding. Aunt Mary had known about the room, had known I would find it, had known whatever was in there was important enough to protect for 3 centuries, but terrible enough to break her. I looked at the ceiling, imagining the room directly above me. What are you keeping? I whispered, and from upstairs, I heard it. The sound of something heavy dragging across a wooden floor. If you're still listening, you're already part of this house. I climbed the stairs slowly, my phone flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The dragging sound had stopped, but I could feel something had changed. The air was heavier, charged with anticipation. The door to the sealed room was open. I hadn't left it open. I was certain of that. But there it was, darkness spilling out into the hallway, and from inside I could hear breathing again, that slow, deliberate rhythm that was too steady to be human. I stepped into the doorway and shone my light into the room. It wasn't empty anymore. In the corner where I'd found Aunt Mary's pencil, there was now furniture, or rather, the impression of furniture. I could see the outline of a small bed, a wooden chair, a table. They weren't physically there, but the space remembered them. Like looking at a photograph that had been partially erased, I could see the ghostly shapes of objects that had once occupied this room. And on the bed, I could see her. A girl, maybe 17, dark hair, thin white nightgown. She was lying on her side, facing the wall, her body curled up in a position that suggested pain or fear or both. She wasn't solid. I could see through her to the wall beyond, but she was there. I took a step closer, and she moved, not startled, but slow, like she was waking from a long sleep. She turned her head, and I saw her face. She looked like Aunt Mary, the same bone structure, the same eyes, family resemblance stretching across 3 centuries. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Anne." Her voice was the same one I'd heard before, but clearer now. Anne Ashford, the name from the death record. Thomas Ashford's daughter, who'd supposedly died of fever in 1692. "You didn't die," I said. "I did." She sat up slowly, the impression of her becoming stronger, more defined, eventually. But not when they said I did. I moved fully into the room now, and the door swung shut behind me, not violently this time, but firmly. I didn't try to open it. I needed to hear this. "What happened to you?" Anne looked at her hands, spreading her fingers like she was surprised to see them. "I saw things," she said. "Visions, future things, things that hadn't happened yet. I knew about the trials before they started. I knew who would be accused, who would die. And when I told my father, she stopped, her throat working. He was afraid. In Salem in 1692, seeing the future meant you were consorting with the devil. It meant you'd hang. So he hid you. He built this room. She gestured at the walls around us. Built it special, with help from a man he'd met in London who understood architecture differently than most. Built it to be separate from the house, isolated from the world. And then he told everyone I'd died. Had a funeral, buried an empty coffin, and brought me here. How long? 23 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. 23 years in this room. He brought me food, water, books sometimes. He said it was to protect me. Said that once the hysteria passed, once Salem was safe again, he'd let me out. Her laugh was bitter, broken. But Salem was never safe again. Not for people like me. And my father, he convinced himself that keeping me here was love, that isolation was better than death. I felt sick. The chain, I said, suddenly understanding the writing on the wall. Someone wrote, keep. They meant keep you here, keep you chained. Anne nodded. There was a ring bolted into the wall. The chain went from my wrist to the ring, just long enough for me to reach the chamber pot and the water bucket. That's all. I looked at where she was pointing. The plaster was smooth there now, painted over, but I could see the faint circular outline where something had been embedded in the wall. When did you die? 1715. I was 40 years old. My father came up one morning and found me. Heart just stopped. I think it gave up. And after, he sealed the room properly. Had the door hidden, the window covered from inside the walls. Told his sister Margaret about me. Made her promise to keep the secret. She inherited the house when he died. And she kept her promise. Kept me. Kept you. I looked at the impression of her sitting on the impression of the bed. You're still here. I'm in the walls, Anne said simply. In the wood and the plaster and the foundation. My father's architect friend. The one who built the room. He used old methods. Methods that bound spaces to things, to people. I was in this room so long that when I died, I stayed. Not as a ghost exactly. As memory. As presence. I thought about the breathing walls. The heartbeat I'd felt in the plaster. The way the room seemed alive. And the women who inherited the house. I said slowly, they all knew about you. Margaret found me first. She came into the room and felt me here. She understood what had happened. And Anne's voice softened. She was kind. She came here often, sat in the chair, talked to me, told me about the world outside, about how Salem had changed, how the trials were regretted now, how people understood the hysteria had been wrong. She made me feel less alone. And when she died, she passed the knowledge to her niece, and that niece to hers, all the way down to Mary, and now to you. Anne looked at me directly. They kept me because I asked them to. Because being remembered was better than being erased completely. Because if the room was destroyed, if the house was sold to strangers who tore down walls and renovated, I'd disappear. Not just from the room, but from history. My father had already erased me from the official record. My death certificate is a lie. My gravestone marks an empty grave. The only people who know I existed are the women of this family. But Anne, I said, my throat tight, is this really better? Being trapped in this room forever? Being a secret? It's what I chose, she said. When Margaret first found me, she offered to tell people, to put my real story in the records. But I was afraid of being judged even after death, afraid of being remembered as a witch or as cursed. So I asked her to keep me private, to let only the family know, and each woman after her has honored that choice. I looked around the room, at the walls that held her, at the window that showed an impossible view, at the writing that had accumulated over centuries. Mary knew, I said, reading the first line again with new understanding. She knew about you. She was the kindest, Anne said softly. She came here almost every day, read to me, told me jokes, brought flowers sometimes and left them on the floor until they wilted. She understood that I was lonely, that being remembered wasn't enough anymore. What do you mean? Anne stood up, the impression of her body becoming stronger, almost solid. I've been here for 310 years. I've been kept and protected and remembered by 8 women, and I'm grateful, truly. But Emma, she looked at me with eyes that held centuries of sadness. I'm tired. I don't want to be a secret anymore. I don't want to be hidden. I want people to know what happened to me. I want my father's crime to be known. I want the truth. The truth will hurt his memory. He'll be remembered as someone who imprisoned his own daughter. Good, Anne said fiercely. He should be remembered that way. What he did was wrong. It was cruel. And calling it love doesn't make it less so. I thought about the letters in the box. About generations of women keeping this secret out of respect for Anne's fear. About Aunt Mary's note saying the weight of it had broken her. If I tell people, I said slowly, if I make this public, you'll be exposed, analyzed, studied. People will want to know how you're here, what you are. They won't just know your story. They'll dissect it. I know. Anne's form was starting to fade now, like maintaining this level of presence was exhausting her. But being dissected is better than being erased. And I think I've been afraid long enough. The room pulsed around us, the walls breathing with her. Will you tell them? She asked. I thought about Aunt Mary, about how she died in the hallway right outside this room, about how the weight of keeping Anne's secret had broken her, about how every woman in this family line had carried this burden, this terrible knowledge, and how they'd all died suddenly, their hearts giving out under the strain. Yes, I said. I'll tell them. I'll tell everyone. Anne smiled, the first smile I'd seen from her. Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to choose differently. The impression of her faded completely, and I was alone in the room again. But the walls felt different now, lighter, like something that had been held tense for centuries was finally beginning to release. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. My phone said it was 3 a.m. I'd been in the room for 5 hours, though it had felt like minutes. I went downstairs, opened my laptop, and started writing. Not a report, not a careful historical document. Just the truth, raw and complete. Anne Ashford was imprisoned in this room from 1692 to 1715. Her father built this house specifically to hide her. She died here, alone, after 23 years of captivity. And for 3 centuries, the women of this family have kept her secret. I wrote until dawn, until my hands cramped and my eyes burned. Then I sent the document to Dr. Whitmore, to the Salem Historical Society, to the Massachusetts Historical Commission, to every historian and journalist whose email I could find. This is the story of the room that Salem forgot, I wrote in the covering email, and it's time everyone remembered. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dr. Whitmore called within an hour of receiving my email, his voice shaking. Miss Thorne, is this real? Can you prove any of this? Come see the room, I said. Bring whoever you need to bring. I'll show you everything. He arrived that afternoon with 6 other people, historians, preservationists, an architectural specialist from MIT, and a woman who introduced herself as a researcher specializing in the witch trial era. I led them upstairs and opened the door. They spent the entire day in that room, documenting everything. The writing on the walls, the iron ring that was still embedded in the plaster beneath layers of paint, the scratches on the floor where Anne had dragged her chair back and forth for 23 years, the window that showed impossible views, and when the MIT specialist set up her equipment and ran thermal scans, the reading showed what Mike and Dr. Whitmore had found. The room existed in its own isolated environment, separate from the rest of the house's physics. This is unprecedented, the MIT specialist said, her voice hushed with awe and horror. The room is architecturally impossible, which means it was built using techniques we don't understand. And the presence. She showed me her readings. There's something here, not just the structure, something that reads as active, responsive. Her name is Anne, I said quietly, and she's been here for 310 years. By the end of the week, the story had gone national. News outlets picked it up. The lost prisoner of Salem, the room that time forgot, Salem witch trial era victim found sealed in family home. Historians wrote articles contextualizing Anne's story within the larger narrative of the trials, noting that she represented the uncounted victims, those who were never officially accused but suffered anyway. The house became famous overnight. People came to stand outside on the sidewalk and take photos. Journalists called constantly, asking for interviews. Documentary producers wanted access to the room, and through it all, I felt the house changing. The room's temperature normalized. The breathing sound stopped. The walls no longer pulsed with that hidden heartbeat. It was like Anne was slowly releasing her grip on the physical space, her presence dissipating as her story spread. I found myself spending hours in the room, sitting on the floor where her bed had been, talking to the emptiness. Are you still here? I asked one afternoon, a week after the story broke. No answer. but I felt something, a warmth in the air, a sense of acknowledgement. "People know now," I said. "People know what happened to you, what your father did. You're not erased anymore." The warmth grew stronger, and for just a moment, I saw her again, not solid, just a flicker. She was smiling, then she was gone. I called a meeting with the Historical Commission and proposed turning the house into a memorial, not just to Anne, but to all the people who'd suffered because of the witch trial hysteria, the official victims who'd been hanged, the unofficial victims like Anne who'd been hidden away, the families torn apart by accusations, the community trauma that had lasted for generations. They agreed immediately. But before I could move forward with that plan, I had to do something else. Something none of the previous women had done. I had to find Anne's real grave. The official record said she was buried in the Charter Street Cemetery in 1692, in the Ashford family plot. But I knew that grave was empty. So where was Anne's body? I spent days searching through Thomas Ashford's papers, which had been stored in the attic and which no one had fully examined before. Most of it was mundane business records. But at the bottom of one trunk, I found a small leather journal, almost identical to the one I'd seen at the museum. This one contained only a few entries, all from late 1715, October 3rd, 1715. Anne died this morning. I found her cold in the room. Her heart had simply stopped. Margaret says I killed her. Perhaps she's right. But I kept her alive for 23 years. That must count for something. October 5th, 1715. I cannot bury her in the family plot. Questions would be asked. So I have buried her here, beneath the room where she lived and died. The floor is her gravestone. Margaret helped me, though she wept throughout. She says I am a monster. Perhaps I am, but I loved my daughter. Everything I did was out of love. Beneath the room. I called Dr. Whitmore immediately. I think Anne's body is buried under the room, in the crawl space or foundation. Her father wrote that he buried her beneath the floor. Are you suggesting we excavate? I'm suggesting we give her a proper burial, with her real name, in a real grave, one that people can visit. There was a long silence. Then, I'll make the calls. It took 2 weeks to get the permits and assemble the team. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what I suspected. There was something buried directly beneath the sealed room, approximately 5 feet down. The excavation happened on a cold morning in March. I stood in the side yard with a small crowd of officials and historians, watching as workers carefully removed earth from the crawl space beneath the house. They found her at noon. The remains were wrapped in canvas, almost completely deteriorated, but the bones were intact, arranged in a position that suggested she'd been buried carefully, reverently, despite the secrecy. A forensic anthropologist examined the skeleton on site. Female, approximately 40 years old at death, she confirmed. The bone structure shows signs of long-term immobility, muscle atrophy consistent with extended confinement. They took Anne's remains to a lab for full analysis and documentation. The results came back 3 weeks later. She'd been undernourished, her bones showing signs of vitamin deficiencies. She'd had several breaks in her wrists and ankles that had healed poorly, consistent with struggling against restraints. Her spine showed curvature from spending years in a small space. The physical evidence supported everything her presence had told me. On April 15th, what would have been her 351st birthday, we held a funeral, not in the Charter Street Cemetery where her fake grave was, but in a new memorial garden created specifically for victims of the witch trial era. Hundreds of people attended, historians, descendants of trial victims, locals, and people who'd just been moved by her story. I spoke at the service. I told them about Anne's visions, about her father's fear, about 23 years in a sealed room. I told them about the 8 women who'd kept her secret because they thought that's what she wanted. And I told them about her final request, to be remembered not as a secret, but as a person. Anne Ashford was 17 when her father imprisoned her, I said. She was 40 when she died. She spent more than half her life in a room that measured 10 feet by 10 feet. She was never accused of witchcraft, never had a trial, never had a chance to defend herself. She was erased from history because her father decided that keeping her hidden was the same as keeping her safe. I looked at the simple gravestone we'd placed, gray granite with clean lines. Anne Ashford, 1675, 1715. I want people to know what happened to me. She's not hidden anymore, I said. She's not a secret. She's Anne, and we'll remember her. After the funeral, I returned to the house one last time. The memorial conversion was scheduled to begin the following week. I'd be moving out, leaving Salem, leaving behind this strange inheritance. I climbed to the second floor and stood in front of the door. It was still there, still oak and iron and impossible. But when I touched it now, it was just wood. No cold, no frost, no heartbeat in the grain. I opened it. The room was completely empty. No writing on the walls. The plaster was blank, as if the messages had never been there. No impression of furniture. No window showing impossible views. Just blank wall where the window had been. The room was finally just a room. I walked to the center and turned in a slow circle. "Goodbye, Anne," I said softly. The air stirred, just slightly, like a breath, and I felt something brush against my hand. Not physical, more like the memory of touch. A thank you. Then nothing. I closed the door and walked away. The house opened as a memorial 6 months later. I attended the ceremony but didn't stay long. Seeing the rooms filled with visitors, hearing tour guides explain Anne's story to school groups, it was what she'd wanted, but it felt strange to be back. Dr. Whitmore pulled me aside before I left. "You should know," he said. "We found 6 other houses in Salem with similar architectural anomalies. Rooms that don't appear in records, spaces that exist in impossible locations. We're investigating whether there were others like Anne, people hidden during the trial hysteria who were never accounted for." "The architect," I said. "Thomas Ashford's contact in London. He must have built rooms like this in other houses. We're researching that now. Your decision to go public with Anne's story has opened up an entirely new area of historical investigation. We may finally get a complete picture of how many people suffered during that period." I left Salem that afternoon and didn't go back for a year. When I finally did return, it was autumn. The memorial garden where Anne was buried was beautiful, filled with flowering plants that bloomed in stages throughout the year, ensuring there was always color, always life. I stood at her gravestone for a long time, reading the epitaph I'd chosen. Other people came and went, leaving flowers or small stones on the grave in the Jewish tradition. Anne had become a symbol, not just of the witch trial era, but of all the people who'd been hidden in silence throughout history. On my way out, I stopped by the house. It was between tours, the building quiet. The current director recognized me and offered to let me go upstairs. "Just for a moment," I said. The second floor was beautifully maintained now, with informational plaques explaining the history. The sealed room's door stood open. Visitors were allowed to go inside, to see where Anne had lived and died. But when I stepped into the doorway, I stopped. The window was back, not physically. The wall was still blank, painted a warm cream color, but I could see it, just for a moment, overlaid on the surface like a photograph. The old glass, the impossible view, the side yard beyond. And through that phantom window, I saw her. Anne stood in the side yard, looking up at the house. She was solid now, real, dressed in modern clothes, jeans and a sweater. She looked about 17, the age she'd been when this all started. She saw me watching and smiled. Then she turned and walked toward the memorial garden, fading with each step until she disappeared completely. I understood then. She wasn't trapped anymore, wasn't bound to the room or the house or the suffering. The window appeared not because she was still here, but because I could finally see where she'd gone, free. I left Salem for the final time as evening fell, the house growing smaller in my rearview mirror. The memorial would continue. Anne's story would be told and retold, but she wasn't in those walls anymore, wasn't in that room, wasn't chained to the past. She'd asked to be remembered, and I'd given her that. But what she'd really needed, what all of them had needed, all those women who'd kept her secret for 3 centuries, was permission to let go. Thomas Ashford built that room because he thought keeping his daughter hidden was the same as keeping her safe. He convinced himself that imprisonment was protection, that silence was love. He was wrong, and it took 300 years for someone to finally say so. The house remembered because it had to, because Anne needed witnesses to what had been done to her, because secrets that big don't stay buried. They seep into walls and floors and foundations until the structure itself becomes a testimony. But now the testimony had been given. The truth had been told. The secret had become history. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories about houses that hide what no one wanted to face. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to keep keeping someone else's secrets. Sometimes the only way to honor the past is to drag it into the light and let everyone see what was done in the darkness. And sometimes the houses remember not because they want to trap us in their histories, but But because they're waiting for someone brave enough to finally tell the truth, the room that Salem forgot wasn't hidden to protect Anne. It was hidden to protect Thomas Ashford's reputation. And 3 centuries later, I chose Anne over him. I think that's what all the others wanted to do too. Margaret and Elizabeth and Catherine and Mary. I think they all felt the weight of that secret crushing them, wanted to tell, wanted to free Anne from the silence. But they'd been taught that keeping family secrets was loyalty, that protecting the dead meant protecting their reputations, that some truths were too terrible to share. I'd been taught differently, and that made all the difference. The door appeared for me not because the house chose me, but because I was the first one willing to see what all the others had looked away from. That remembering isn't the same as honoring. That keeping a secret isn't the same as keeping someone safe. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth, no matter how ugly it is. Anne Ashford lived for 40 years and spent more than half of them in a room 10 feet by 10 feet. She died alone, in chains, believing her father's love was real, even as it destroyed her. She stayed in those walls for 300 years, waiting, and when I finally asked her what she wanted, really wanted, not what everyone else thought she should want, she chose freedom, even if freedom meant being exposed, even if it meant her suffering would be known, even if it meant breaking 3 centuries of tradition. She chose truth over secrecy, and that's how I knew what to do. The houses remember because we need them to, because we bury our histories in foundations and walls and locked rooms, and then we pretend they're not there, but they are, always, and eventually, someone has to open the door and let the light in. I'm glad it was me. I'm glad I was brave enough to choose Anne's truth over Thomas Ashford's reputation. I'm glad I was the one who finally said, this was wrong. What happened here was wrong, and everyone should know. The room that Salem forgot is forgotten no more, and neither is Anne.